So let's talk about some examples of the application of adaptive management. So as I said, the mid-continent mallard harvest is one of the classic examples of the good application of the adaptive management paradigm. And you have to start out with objectives. And there's two objectives that the managers wanted to maximize here. One is, or two overall objectives. The first one is to maximize long-term harvest. This is a very important source of revenue for many state agencies, and their objective is to try to get that harvest as high as they can to keep the hunters happy. And they had a constraint to maintain the North American waterfowl plan of at least 8.1 million mallards in the mid-continent region. So historically, the approach to this is really well depicted by this figure, where you'd get together managers from all the different state agencies in the region, bring in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they just duke it out as to how long the season is, what the bag limits are, if there's any differences among the states, and all of that. And it was a very messy and difficult situation. So your next step after you set your objectives is to come up with a set of management alternatives. And there's a lot that goes into this. It's determined by the managers based on feasibility and political palatability. Different options will result in different cost benefits, and practically the number of options should be kept fairly limited for a period, so that you're not just going crazy with evaluating lots and lots of different options. And for mallard harvest, as with most waterfowl waterfowl harvest, is you've got sort of two management options. One is how many ducks you let the hunters shoot on a day, and that's usually determined by the bag limits. So you can have a totally closed season where you just don't allow any hunting of that species, a restrictive season where you maybe only allowed one or two animals to be harvested in a day, moderate and liberal bag limits, maybe up to half a dozen, for instance. And the other thing that you can manage is season length. And so how long can hunters go out and harvest waterfowl? So these are the two pieces of management action that the managers have available to them. And then, as we said, the third thing you need to do before you start making decisions about what management options to apply is you have to have some model that helps you understand the system and make predictions about how you think the different management actions might impact the system. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail here on this duck model, but in some ways it's has some similarities to the matrix models that you guys just worked on, where you start with your breeding population, and then you have a certain level of survival between the summer breeding season and the fall when the adults arrive on the wintering grounds. And then you have a certain killing rate. So 1 minus that would be the survival through the hunting season. The winter population is the population size at the end of the hunting season. This A here is an interesting one. It's basically the ratio of adults to juveniles, and that's going to really be determined by the number of ponds up on the prairie pothole region where these birds breed. So if you have more ponds, that's going to give you more productivity, and you're going to have more young birds coming south in the fall. And we know that young birds have a different rate of harvest than adult birds. They're dumb. They don't know about hunting, and they just tend to fly right into decoy sets and over hunter blinds and so on. So they definitely are harvested at a higher rate than the adults. So the managers wanted to make sure that was incorporated into the model. And then you have what they call winter survival from kind of the end of the um, hunting season to the breeding season. And then there's two sort of fundamental biological concepts that are overlaid on top of this model that I just showed you. One is the idea that survival during the hunting season is what we call additive, and I'm sure you've heard this in some of your earlier wildlife ecology courses, where basically the idea is that if you remove an animal from the population because of hunting, that's just going to reduce the survival of that group of individuals by the amount of the harvest. Okay, so that's additive. So harvest mortality is additive to natural mortality. The other idea that's been around for a long time and really was sort of one of the fundamental concepts of the wildlife management discipline is this idea of compensatory mortality. The idea that there's essentially more animals out there in the fall than the resources can support. So you have this big increase in your population size from all the reproduction, and there's going to be a lot of animals dying regardless of whether there's hunting. Okay, and so the thought is that there will be a certain range of harvest. So this is a kill rate again, which will result in no drop in overall survival. So survival stays right where it would be in the absence of hunting until you reach some threshold. And beyond that, basically, your hunting mortality is going to be additive to your um, natural mortality. But there's always this thought that you can harvest, 5 or 10% of the population, and it really is just going to be compensated for by the remaining animals surviving better because there's more resources or more places to hide or whatever. And then the second fundamental um, process here is this idea of density dependence and logistic growth curve that we've talked about. And the way they incorporate this is to look at how the number of ducks influences the productivity of the population. So under the weak density dependence hypothesis, basically as population size of ducks goes up, you get a little bit of a drop in number of young produced, but relatively small drop. Under the strong density dependence hypothesis, basically you get a very rapid decline in this ratio of young birds to adults as the number of ducks increases. So hence the weak versus strong density dependence. So going back to our model, we take these relationships between survival in one case and productivity in the other in relation to duck population size, and we come up with basically 4 different model alternatives. So we have one model with additive hunting mortality and weak density dependence in recruitment. So that's sort of, you can think of as our most conservative model. The ducks, really aren't, they're going to be more sensitive to hunting, and therefore you have to be more careful in terms of your bag limits and so on. The second would be, again, additive hunting mortality, but now strong density dependent recruitment. So even if the population drops, you're going to get a lot of young produced probably that following year. It'll bounce back. Third is compensatory hunting mortality. with weak density dependent recruitment. And then finally, the most liberal model, if you will, compensatory hunting. So they compensate for loss from hunting, and strong density dependent recruitment. So even again, if they're knocked down, they'll be able to bounce right back very quickly. So these four different models then generate four different sets of predictions about how you should manage that duck population. So if we look at the most restrictive situation here, where you have additive hunting effects and relatively weak recruitment or density dependence, you can see that you have a large area here that's black, and that means it says in those under those combinations, you basically close down the harvest. You don't harvest any birds, okay? And the axes are a little bit weird here. So on the left is population size, breeding population of the mallard population going from low to high as you go from top to bottom, okay? Bottom's 10 million, top is 2 million. And then along the y-axis is the number of ponds. So you can see that if you got a lot of, wet year, a lot of ponds, you're going to get a lot of breeding productivity. That's why this line in the green is liberal harvest, yellow is moderate, red is restrictive. So you can see that, you move from liberal harvest to no harvest, largely as a function of population size, but also the number of ponds. And then if we just look at the lower right here, this is the most liberal hunting harvest situation, where basically under almost all conditions you implement liberal harvest, even when the population gets down pretty low, and then you put on the brakes a little bit with a moderate harvest. So actually fairly different predictions based on these four different models. So here's just a zoomed in version of that those previous boxes, and this is what the harvest decision was for the 1995 season. They basically went with a real liberal approach to harvest. Really didn't matter exactly where the population was or the number of ponds. You were going to go out and blast a lot of ducks. And it turns out that year the population was pretty high, right up around 9 million. And there was, maybe a little above average number of ponds, about 4 million. So you predict that the population would do well even with liberal hunting regulations. So then what you do is you go through a iterative process. And what they did is they started with equal model weights for all four of these models. We didn't make any preference for one or the other, and you know what model weights are now. They started with the current number of mallards in the system. They implemented the liberal harvest regulations, and then made predictions about where you'd expect the population to be the following year. So, with the model with additive mortality and low density dependence, you get a prediction that population will be the same or drop a little. With the other models where you have compensatory mortality in the population, they say it's going to go up even after you shoot a lot of birds. So those two sets of models really kind of separate. So then you take a look at, all right, let's see what actually happened. And boom, that next year, the number of ducks in the system were predicted very well by the additive weak density dependence model. So, right off the bat, that should have made them start thinking, all right, maybe it's not, they're not as resilient as we thought. So then based on that information, you come up with new model weights. So now the additive weak is coming up as having much higher support. So that's again, suggesting that there's, depending on the population and the number of ponds, you may, even shut down the harvest. It turns out that again, population size was pretty high, ponds were pretty high, so they implemented another liberal harvest. In this case, it bounced back up to predictions closer to the compensatory. So I'll just go along here, and you can see that hits right on the additive week prediction over all of the predictions, then additive week. And so over time, basically what they found over these first 7 years is that more of the support came in stronger and stronger for additive mortality and weak density dependence. So you can see by the end of this, model weight for that particular one is 97%, which, as you know, is pretty darn high. And to just kind of summarize many years of data, this is a paper that came out in 2015, I believe, summarizing the information up through 2013. And what they found is, again, by the end, the model with additive mortality and weak density dependence had by far the most support. And here you can see trends over time. Those early years, there were relatively a lot of ducks. Then went through a dry period. Populations went down. And now, or as of 13 anyway, it was up to about 10 million ducks again. So, they've learned a lot through this. I have to say, I think at the beginning of this, I think most wildlife biologists would say the compensatory models with the either weak or strong density dependence would have been favored. So this is really kind of changing our views of hunting and how it impacts populations. So we actually have learned a lot through this process. So as we talked about, adaptive management is great when you've got iterative management decisions. So hunting regulations are perfect for this. Management is limited by an incomplete understanding of the impacts, and an improved understanding can lead to better management, which it certainly has in the case of the mallard management. What it is not is a one-size-fits-all approach. Again, there aren't a lot of situations where you have all of these things above lining up. It's not trial and error management. You really have to think hard before you get started, make predictions, and then follow through and adjust your management as you go. It's also not the most efficient way to learn about the system. It's going to take time and a lot of effort in order to really get the information you want. Which means that patience and commitment are really required for implementing this, which is maybe why it's so hard to implement in state and federal agencies, because oftentimes because of political changes, the objectives and desires change, and so it's hard to keep a consistent approach going for more than a few years. Another situation where this is being applied is in warm water management of Florida manatees. And basically here, just trying to keep these things from going extinct. And there's actually two kind of interesting things going on here. One is manatees love the warm water that comes out of these obsolete power plants along the coast of the Gulf of Florida. They prefer warm water in the winter, and these plants produce a lot of that, and so they really love going in and hanging out around those, but at the same time we'd love to shut those plants down. And secondly, we know that waterboat traffic is a large source of mortality to manatees. You've probably seen the pictures of propeller scars across their backs and so on. So the decision here involves deciding which power plants to shut down. Obviously, you want to use the ones that have the least impact on the population. Um, and then regulating waterboat traffic. And here there's a lot of contention because people in Florida love to drive their boats and drive them fast, and that's not compatible with manatees living in an area. So a lot of regulations about when you can boat, what time, speeds, and all sorts of things. So a very complex interaction between these two management approaches. Another example that um, folks who are from the East Coast might be aware of, but those who aren't maybe don't. And that is the impact of horseshoe crab harvest on red knots. Horseshoe crabs are these really primitive animals. They're like 450 million years old or something. Sometimes get really big, like 10 inches across the top there, and live in shallow estuarine areas along the east coast. And in the spring, what happens is they come up on the beaches like this and they lay massive numbers of eggs. And the timing of migration of red knots is perfectly coincides with the time that the horseshoe crabs come up and breed. And it turns out that fuel is really important for their migration. They winter all the way down in southern South America, come up, don't make many stops, and this stop, especially on Chesapeake Bay on the East Coast, is a really important refueling area, and then they jump from there almost all the way up to the Arctic. So it's really important that they get a lot of energy. And what's been happening is horseshoe crabs have been harvested over the last many years. One reason is for their blood, and they really do have blue blood. They have a different compound to carry um, oxygen in their blood, cyan, instead of hemoglobin. And then there's other components of their blood that can be used in certain kinds of medical tests. And the other thing, unfortunately, I think that has led to a lot of harvest is to just basically grind them up and use them for pet food. And so the ornithologists have been noting the decline of red knots, and there's evidence that this harvest is causing that decline. And so as a result, they've pulled together stakeholders on both sides and are starting to regulate the amount of harvest and how many horseshoe crabs can be taken, and protecting certain areas of the shoreline so that red knots have areas where they can go and forage undisturbed. So they're trying to make some progress on this. So as I mentioned, adaptive management is only one of many approaches that can be used for this whole process of decision making, and you can see that it occupies one relatively small portion of this spectrum here, going from clear to obscured objectives, and from well understood to really poorly understood systems. And one situation that we often get into here at the top is basically just conflict resolution, when you really don't have clear objectives, and wolf management in Colorado may fall into this. You know, what are the objectives? What are the impacts? And so on. Really, you need to just go through some conflict resolution until you can get all sides sort of agreeing to the objectives, and then you can move into various types of decision making, structured decision making, adaptive management, joint fact finding. Obviously, we're not dealing with any of these other approaches. Larissa is got a course that basically addresses these different approaches to management, and you guys are probably looking to get out of here and not take more courses, but if you got another semester or so, you might think about that one. It would be a really good one if you're thinking of going into management. So that's it, folks. I'm going to sign off and say goodbye and say I've really enjoyed teaching you guys this semester. I've really been impressed by how diligently you've worked on all of these labs and other assignments. I know some of them have been kind of tedious, and Mark is not your friend a lot of the times, but you've hung in there and gotten through it, and I'm really impressed by how everybody's done since the whole shift to online learning. I thought it was going to be, uh, a really difficult lift to get this information taught to you, but I can tell by looking at the results of that second midterm that you guys are getting it. You're getting the labs, so give yourselves a pat on the back and stay safe. Um, See you next time. Bye bye.